Sarah Fletcher was 27 years old and owned exactly $3 to her name when she realized she was going to freeze to death in her own cabin. Not dramatically, like the stories she'd heard of travelers caught in blizzards. Not suddenly, just slowly, gradually, inevitably, over the course of a Montana winter that stretched 6 brutal months long. It was September 1867, and she sat at her rough-hewn table doing math that refused to work no matter how many times she recalculated. The numbers stared back at her from the page, mocking her with their inflexibility. Her husband Daniel worked the railroad construction camps 40 miles north, part of the crew laying track for the Northern Pacific Line. Back-breaking work, dangerous work, but steady pay. He sent back $18 monthly, money orders that arrived like clockwork, keeping them alive but barely. Rent on their tiny one-room cabin, $6 to the land company that owned most of the settlement. Food for her and their 3-year-old daughter Emma, $8 if she bought carefully, stretched everything, made soup from bones. That left $4 for everything else in the world. Clothing when Emma grew, tools when things broke, medicine if someone got sick, and firewood. $4 would buy maybe 2 cords of split wood from the lumber camp if she negotiated hard. 2 cords would heat their small cabin for perhaps 6 weeks if she burned it sparingly, if she let the fire die at night and shivered under blankets, if she accepted cold mornings and frozen water buckets. Montana winter lasted 24 weeks, sometimes 26. The math didn't work. It had never worked. It was mathematics of desperation that never quite added up to survival. Last winter, she'd made it through by burning everything that wasn't structurally necessary. The chair Daniel had made before leaving, the crate their dishes came in, fence posts she'd pulled from the property line. The outhouse had nearly become firewood in March when she'd run completely out. This winter, she had nothing left to burn. She'd already consumed every spare piece of wood on their property. The cabin itself was the only wood remaining, and if she started burning that, well, then they'd be homeless and freezing instead of just freezing. She stood in her cabin, looking at the small iron stove, a battered thing Daniel had bought used for $3, doing the calculation again in her head, hoping somehow the numbers would magically change if she just thought about them differently. They didn't. They never did. She had $4. Winter was coming in 6 weeks, and she was going to freeze. Emma played on the floor with her corn husk doll, making up songs, oblivious to the mathematical impossibility of her survival. 3 years old, too young to understand that her mother had no solution, that frontier poverty meant sometimes you just didn't make it. That's when she met Laughing Bird Woman. Sarah had taken Emma to the creek to fetch water, following the path through cottonwood trees, down to where the water ran clear and cold. She was filling her bucket when she noticed someone watching from the far bank. An older woman, maybe 60, with long grey hair in a single braid. She wore a deerskin dress and moccasins, was gathering something from the water's edge. Cattails, hundreds of cattails, the tall reeds with brown fuzzy tops that grew thick along the creek. Sarah knew enough to be polite. "Good morning." The woman looked up, smiled. "You are the railroad wife, the one with the small girl." "Yes, Sarah Fletcher. This is Emma. I am called Laughing Bird Woman. I have watched you gathering wood from the forest. You take only deadfall, only what has fallen." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "I can't afford to buy cutwood, so yes, I gather what I can find. And it will not be enough for winter." It wasn't a question. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "No, it won't be enough." Laughing Bird Woman studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the piles of cattails she'd gathered. "My people, we use these. The stems are hollow, filled with air. Air does not move, so cold cannot travel through. We bundle them tight, pack them into walls, make houses warm with no fire or small fire only." Sarah looked at the cattails, looked at the woman. "Reeds?" You heat houses with reeds? Not heat, trap heat. Keep warm inside. The white people, they think they must make heat. My people know, stop the cold from entering. If cold cannot enter, small fire makes big warmth. I don't understand. Laughing Bird Woman smiled patiently. Come, I show you. She took Sarah to her dwelling, a structure Sarah had seen from a distance but never approached. It looked primitive, almost like a large basket, dome-shaped, maybe 10 feet in diameter. The walls were made of woven cattail reeds, layer upon layer, at least a foot thick. Touch, Laughing Bird Woman instructed. Sarah pressed her hand against the wall. It was solid, dense, almost rigid from how tightly packed the reeds were. It's thick. Yes, thickness stops wind. Hollow stems stop cold. Inside, very warm. Come. They ducked through the low doorway. Inside was dark, cool, and smelled faintly of dried grass. There was no fire, no stove, just the thick walls and a few sleeping mats. In winter, with 4 people and small fire, this stays 70 degrees inside. Warmer than your cabin with big stove, yes? Sarah thought about her cabin, about how she burned wood constantly and still woke to see her breath. Much warmer. These reeds, they grow everywhere by water, free. You cut them, you dry them, you bundle them, then you line your walls, make your cold house warm. Line my walls. Inside, pack the reeds between your wall and new inside wall, or outside. Cover your whole cabin like blanket. Reeds are free, work is free, only need time and your hands. Sarah looked around the interior, at the tight weave of stems, at the simple genius of it. Would people let me cut reeds from the creek? Creek belongs to Creator, not to people. You take what you need. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the cattail dwelling, about Laughing Bird Woman's words. Reeds were free, the creek was full of them. If she could line her cabin walls with a foot of packed cattails, would it really stay warm? She did more math. Not dollar math this time, thermal math. Her cabin walls were single-layer planks. Wood conducts cold. Wind finds gaps. Heat escapes constantly. She burned wood to replace lost heat, fighting a battle she couldn't win. But if she packed the walls with hollow-stemmed reeds, air trapped in thousands of hollow stems, that would be insulation, real insulation, like the expensive batting that rich people used, but free. The next morning, she walked to the creek and started cutting cattails. She used a kitchen knife, wading into the shallow water, cutting stems at the base. Each stem was 5 to 7 feet tall, thick as her thumb. She bundled them in groups of 50, tied them with twine, dragged them back to her cabin. By evening she had 200 stems. It had taken her 6 hours of constant work. She needed thousands. Emma watched from the cabin step, playing with a corn husk doll. "Mama, what are you doing?" "Building something, baby, building warmth." It took her 3 weeks to cut enough cattails. She worked every day, sunrise to sunset, wading in cold September water, cutting until her hands cramped. She cut over 10,000 stems, bundled them, stacked them beside her cabin in piles that grew taller than her head. The neighbors noticed immediately. Of course they noticed. In a frontier settlement where everyone knew everyone's business, where boredom made gossip the primary entertainment, a woman building something strange became instant news. Martha Hendricks was the first to comment, stopping by on Sarah's second week of construction with a basket of mending as excuse. "Sarah, dear, what on earth are you doing with all those weeds piled up beside your cabin? It looks like you're planning to build something." "They're cattails, Martha. I'm using them for insulation." Martha's face did something complicated, shifting from curiosity to confusion to poorly concealed horror. "Insulation? You mean like wool batting? But those are just... They're swamp grass, Sarah. They're what Indians use." Yes, they keep heat trapped inside hollow stems. Same principle as wool batting, but free. Sarah. Martha set down her basket, voice going soft and careful, the way people speak to children or the feeble-minded or those who've lost touch with reality. That's savage practice. We're civilized women, Christian women. We use proper materials. Wool batting from the store-bought insulation, not swamp grass like some primitive tribe. I can't afford wool batting, Martha. It's $4 per roll, and I'd need 15 rolls. These cattails are free, and they work on the same scientific principle. But what will people think? What will the Reverend say? A white woman using Indian methods, building something that looks like one of their huts? Sarah felt her jaw tighten. I'll think I'm warm. I'll think my daughter isn't shivering. That's what I'll think. And I don't much care what the Reverend says when he's sitting in his well-heated parsonage paid for by congregation tithes. Martha left, shaking her head, face pinched with disapproval. By evening, the whole settlement knew. Sarah Fletcher, the poor railroad wife, was building some kind of Indian shelter, using reeds like a savage, probably going to paint her face next and dance around fires. The mockery started small but grew. Thomas Brennan, who owned the feed store, rode past her cabin that week and shouted loud enough for everyone on the street to hear, "Building a beaver dam there, Mrs. Fletcher? Should I bring you some sticks to chew on?" His friends laughed. Sarah ignored them and kept working. Young boys, emboldened by adult mockery, started throwing stones at her cattail piles. "Squaw woman! Squaw woman!" they'd chant, then run away giggling. Rebecca Carlson, the schoolteacher, pulled Emma aside one day and asked her, voice dripping with false concern, "Is your mother feeling well, dear? Is she acting strangely at home?" Emma, 3 years old and confused, just nodded and said her mama was building warmth. The Reverend himself, Josiah Matthews, came to counsel Sarah on the 3rd week, stood in her doorway, wouldn't come inside, looking at her reed-lined walls with barely concealed disgust. "Mrs. Fletcher, members of the congregation have expressed concern. They say you're adopting heathen practices, building in the manner of savages. I'm insulating my cabin so my daughter doesn't freeze, Reverend. Jesus told us to care for the least of these. Right now I am the least of these. This is me caring for myself when no one else will." "But the methods, Mrs. Fletcher, the appearance of the thing. Would you prefer I freeze to death using Christian methods, Reverend? Would that be more acceptable to the congregation?" "Sarah, people are talking. They say you're building something strange, something Indian. I'm insulating our cabin so our daughter doesn't freeze. With swamp grass, with hollow-stemmed reeds that trap air and stop cold. It's not magic, Daniel, it's physics. Air is the best insulator there is. These stems are full of trapped air. A foot of packed cattails is as good as a foot of wool batting, but I don't have $50 for wool batting. I have reeds and time." Daniel looked at the piles of cattails, at his wife's determined face, at their daughter playing nearby. "And you really think this will work?" Laughing Bird Woman's house stays 70 degrees in winter with 4 people and a tiny fire. Our cabin stays 50 degrees with me burning wood constantly. The difference is insulation. She has it. We don't. Now we will. He didn't argue further, just helped her carry water for supper and left 2 days later to return to the railroad camps. Sarah's plan was simple but labor-intensive. She would build an inner wall inside her cabin, creating a 1-foot gap between the original plank wall and the new inner wall. Then she'd pack that gap completely full of cattail stems, standing them vertically, bundled tight so no air could move between them. She started with the north wall, the one that faced winter wind, the wall where frost formed on the inside of the planks every morning last winter. She took down the few items hanging there, a mirror Daniel's mother had given them, a shelf holding 3 tin cups. She marked her measurements carefully using a piece of charcoal, drawing lines 1 foot in from the existing wall. Then she built a frame using scrap lumber she'd been collecting all summer, pieces too small or damaged for anyone else to want. Vertical studs every 3 feet, horizontal cross braces top and bottom, creating a skeleton for a new inner wall that would stand 1 foot inside the original. The gap between old wall and new frame was where the magic would happen, or where her foolish plan would fail, one or the other. Then came the cattails. She'd let them dry for 2 weeks in the September sun, turning them twice daily so moisture would evaporate evenly. Now they were light, brittle, golden brown, and still hollow. She tested one, blowing through the stem. Air moved freely through the tube. She bundled them in groups of 50 using twine, making tight cylinders of stems. Each bundle was 8 inches in diameter, 5 feet tall, surprisingly rigid when bound tight. She'd made 120 bundles, 6,000 stems. Would it be enough? She stood the first bundle upright in the corner where wall met floor. It fit perfectly in the 1-foot gap. She placed the second bundle beside it, pushing them together until there was no space between. The hollow stems compressed slightly, creating an even denser mat of air-filled tubes. She worked her way along the wall, bundle after bundle, packing them so tight her hands hurt from forcing them into place. The hollow stems made soft crackling sounds as they compressed. By the time she reached the far corner, she'd used 18 bundles for just the bottom 3 feet of one wall. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting. Her hands were raw from handling the rough, dry stems. But when she stepped back and looked at it, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. The gap was filling, solid, dense, a foot-thick wall of hollow stems, thousands of tiny air chambers, each one trapping the best insulator nature provided. She worked from bottom to top, standing on a crate to reach higher sections, bundle after bundle. By evening, she'd completed one wall entirely, 27 bundles, 1,350 stems standing vertically, packed so tight you couldn't slide a knife between them. She pressed her hand against the inner surface, where the frame would eventually be covered with canvas or muslin. It felt different than wood, softer, yielding slightly to pressure, and warmer somehow, though no heat source was present, just the density of trapped air already beginning to insulate. It took her 2 full weeks to complete the north wall. Her hands developed calluses on top of blisters. Her shoulders ached constantly from lifting. Emma helped sometimes, carrying small bundles, keeping her mother company during the long hours of repetitive work. She moved to the east wall next. Same process. Frame building, bundle packing, the monotonous rhythm of construction that measured time in stems and aching muscles instead of hours. The south wall had her door and window, so she only filled the solid sections. By late October, she'd used 8,000 cattail stems and lost 7 feet of interior space to the thickness of insulation. Her cabin looked strange now. The walls were a foot thicker than before. The room felt smaller, and covered in the golden brown of dried cattails. It looked primitive, almost like Laughing Bird Woman's dwelling had grown inside her wooden cabin. The neighbors were appalled. "It looks like a nest," Amanda Brennan said, peering through Sarah's window while Sarah was outside, "like some kind of giant bird nest." "She's living like a savage," Martha Hendricks told the Reverend, teaching her daughter heathen ways. "It's unseemly," agreed several other women. "A white woman should have standards." Sarah heard the talk but didn't care. She had more important concerns. November was coming, and with it, the first test. The cold arrived on November 3rd. Temperature dropped to 35 degrees overnight. Sarah woke, expecting to feel the familiar chill, expecting to need to start her fire immediately. Instead, the cabin felt comfortable, not warm exactly, but not cold either. She checked her thermometer, the small mercury instrument Daniel had bought her last Christmas. 62 degrees inside, 35 degrees outside. She'd slept through the night without a fire and woken to a cabin that was 62 degrees. She lit a small fire in her stove, just enough to cook breakfast. Used maybe 5 pieces of firewood. The interior temperature rose to 68 and stayed there all day, even after the fire died. She couldn't believe it. She checked the thermometer 3 times, certain she was reading it wrong. But no, 68 degrees with minimal fire. Outside was 30 degrees now. That evening, she used 6 more pieces of wood to cook dinner and warm water for washing. Temperature rose to 70 degrees. She let the fire die completely overnight. The next morning, the cabin was 65 degrees. Had dropped only 5 degrees overnight with no fire at all. By the end of November, she'd established a pattern. 1 small fire in the morning for cooking and heating water. 1 small fire in the evening. Maybe 12 pieces of wood per day total. Her cabin maintained between 65 and 70 degrees constantly. Her neighbors were burning through cords of wood, keeping their fires going day and night, and still their cabins were barely 60 degrees. Some mornings they woke to frozen water buckets despite burning wood all night. Sarah was using 1/10 of the wood they used and staying warmer. December brought real cold. Temperature dropped below 0. Wind howled down from the mountains. This was the test. This would prove whether her reed shelter worked or was just autumn luck. She woke on the coldest morning of December to 15 below 0 outside. Inside her cabin, the thermometer read 64 degrees. She hadn't lit her stove in 12 hours. She lit a small fire for breakfast, used 8 pieces of wood. Temperature rose to 71 degrees. That same morning, Martha Hendricks burned through half a day's wood just to get her cabin warm enough to dress without shaking. Word got around. Sarah Fletcher's strange Indian house was warmer than normal cabins, much warmer, and she was barely using any firewood. Thomas Brennan came to investigate, the same man who'd mocked her for building a beaver dam. "Mrs. Fletcher, people are saying your cabin stays warm without fire. That can't be true. Come inside. See for yourself." He came in skeptically, looked at the reed-lined walls with barely concealed disgust, then checked her stove. Cold, dead, no fire. "It's warm in here," he admitted, confused. 66 degrees, Sarah confirmed, showing him the thermometer. "No fire since last night. It's 15 below outside." "How?" "Insulation. These hollow stems trap air. Air doesn't conduct cold, so cold can't get in. My body heat, my daughter's, the residual heat from morning cooking all gets trapped inside. It's like a thermos. Keeps hot things hot by preventing heat from escaping." "But it's just grass." "It's thousands of hollow tubes creating dead air space. That's what insulation is. Wool batting works the same way, trapping air between fibers. This traps air inside hollow stems. Same principle. Free materials." Thomas left looking thoughtful. By January, Sarah had used less than 1 cord of wood, barely a dent in her modest supply. Her neighbors were into their 4th and 5th cords, spending money they didn't have, cutting green trees they'd need for spring building projects, burning fence posts and furniture in acts of increasing desperation. The settlement was running out of wood, and winter was only half over. Martha Hendricks came to Sarah's cabin on a bitter January afternoon. She knocked softly, almost apologetically. When Sarah opened the door, Martha was shaking despite wearing every coat she owned. "May I come in?" Martha asked, voice small. Sarah stepped aside. Martha entered, and her body language changed immediately. She stopped shaking, looked around in wonder at the warm interior, at the reed-lined walls she'd once called savage. "Sarah, Martha's voice broke. She tried again. "I was wrong. I thought you were being foolish, adopting heathen practices, embarrassing yourself and the rest of us. But my children are cold every single morning. We wake to ice on the inside of our windows, despite burning wood all night. Thomas cut down 3 fence posts yesterday because we've run completely out of seasoned wood. We don't have money for more. I don't know how we'll make it to spring." She was crying now, this woman who'd judged Sarah so harshly 3 months ago. "My youngest, Mary. She's coughing constantly from the smoke of wet wood. The cabin's never warm enough. Never." Martha wiped her eyes with a threadbare handkerchief. "And here you are, comfortable, using a fraction of the wood, and I mocked you for it. I told people you were acting like a savage. I was cruel and stupid and wrong." Sarah looked at the woman who'd called her methods primitive, who'd questioned her sanity, who'd whispered about her to the Reverend. Martha was 43 years old, looked 60, worn down by frontier life and the particular exhaustion of never being warm. "I can show you how to do what I did," Sarah said quietly. "It's not complicated, just labor and humility. But people will talk. They'll say we're copying you, copying Indian methods. They'll judge us the way we judged you." Sarah felt something harden in her chest. "Martha, you can be proud and cold, or humble and warm. You can care about what people think, or you can care about your children's health, but you can't have both. Not out here. Not when survival means doing things that don't look respectable to people who've never been desperate." Martha nodded slowly. "How do I start?" So Sarah taught her, showed her where the cattails grew thickest along the creek, how to cut them at the base, working in the shallows despite the cold water, how to bundle them in groups of 50, binding them tight with twine, how to dry them properly, turning them twice daily, how to build the inner frame that would hold them in place, how to pack them until no air could move between bundles, until the wall became a solid mass of trapped air and hollow stems. Martha worked alongside her for 2 weeks. Other women came to watch, curious, skeptical, desperate. Rebecca Carlson, the school teacher who'd questioned Emma about whether Sarah was acting strangely. Anna Brennan, wife of the man who'd mocked Sarah for building a beaver dam. Elizabeth Harris, who told her own children to stay away from that strange woman Fletcher. One by one they swallowed their pride and asked to learn, showed them how to cut the stems, how to bundle them, how to build the inner frame, how to pack everything tight. Some did full walls like Sarah, others just did the north wall where wind hit hardest. All reported the same results: dramatic decrease in firewood needs, consistent interior warmth, comfortable winters for the first time. The Reverend came to talk to Sarah in March, after the worst of winter had passed. "Mrs. Fletcher, I owe you an apology. When I heard you were using Indian methods, I thought you were abandoning Christian civilization. I was wrong. You've helped half the families in this settlement survive winter with dignity. That's Christian charity, whatever the method." "I learned from Laughing Bird Woman," Sarah said quietly. "She gave me knowledge freely when I had nothing. The charity was hers first. Will you continue teaching others?" "Anyone who asks. Poverty shouldn't mean freezing, and pride shouldn't mean ignorance." When Daniel came home in April, he found their cabin warm, their firewood pile barely touched, and his wife teaching a class of 12 women how to identify, cut, and prepare cattails for insulation. "You did it," he said that night, holding her close. "I didn't believe it would work, but you did it. Laughing Bird Woman did it. I just listened. No, she showed you a principle. You figured out how to apply it to a frontier cabin. That's innovation, Sarah. That's intelligence." The next winter, 1868, 43 families in the settlement had reed-insulated walls. Some did full coverage like Sarah, most did partial, just the coldest walls, but all cut their firewood needs by at least half. Sarah's method spread. By 1870, homesteaders across Montana Territory were using cattail insulation. Some called it Fletcher's method, others called it reed wrap. But everyone who used it stayed warmer and spent less. Laughing Bird Woman visited Sarah one spring morning in 1869, looked at the transformation, at the white families using native techniques, at the knowledge passing from culture to culture. "You shared what I showed you," she observed. It was too valuable to keep secret. People were suffering. You gave me the answer. I had to share it. My people believe knowledge is meant to flow like water. You understand this. You are a good student. They sat together by the creek, watching Emma play with Laughing Bird Woman's granddaughter, watching cattails grow thick and green in the shallow water. Resources waiting to be harvested. Warmth waiting to be captured. Your people called me savage, Laughing Bird Woman said without anger. Just statement. Said our ways were primitive. My people were wrong. Your people understand things we forgot or never learned. Maybe your people will learn now. Maybe my people and your people can teach each other. It didn't work out that way. The treaties came, the relocations. By 1872, Laughing Bird Woman and her people were moved to reservation land 200 miles north. Sarah never saw her again. But every winter when Sarah lit her small, efficient fire and felt her reed-lined cabin hold warmth, like a hand holding water, she thought of the woman who'd shared knowledge across cultural boundaries, who'd seen a stranger in need and offered solutions instead of judgment. Sarah Fletcher lived in her reed-sheltered cabin until 1891, when Daniel retired from railroad work and they moved to Helena. But she never stopped teaching the technique, never stopped advocating for what she called practical wisdom from any source. She died in 1903 at age 63. Her obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned that she'd been a pioneer advocate for cross-cultural learning and practical innovation. It didn't mention the cattails, didn't mention the winter she'd saved her family with hollow stems and humility. But in Montana Territory, on homesteads across the frontier, families still lined their walls with reeds every autumn, still stayed warm through brutal winters with minimal wood, still proved that the best solutions come from listening to those who've survived longest, in the places where survival is hardest. And some of them, the ones who remembered, called it Laughing Bird Woman's gift, because that's what it was.